Welcome to C3 in This Together, 30 minutes in our own voice, a mental health awareness series. Today's topic, from jail to Yale. Wow, wow, wow. Already, my friends, I know you're leaning into that. We're going to talk a lot about that today. But again, our topic is from jail to Yale. We will hear from someone with a lived experience in mental health, prison reform, and restorative justice. Today, our guest is George Chochos, great friend, but by way of introduction, he is Senior Program Associate at the Vera Institute of Justice. He is a PhD student in Theological and Religious Studies at Georgetown University and Director of Prison Ministry at Emory Fellowship in Washington, D.C. My friends, this is an amazing man, amazing credentials, amazing journey, and we are so honored to have him here today. George, welcome, my friend.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Great, great. We look forward to our time together. Well, before we jump in to our time, allow me just to share some statistics surrounding the criminal legal system and mental health as we are, leaning into that today. Just wanted to share some statistics for our friends, and George, you may speak to that, once I'm done with that. But here's what we do know from the research and from the statistics. Over 2.2 million people are incarcerated in the United States. We know that over 225,000 women are also incarcerated. And we do know from statistics that the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, people are more incarcerated in state prisons than any other people group or demographic. In fact, at a rate of nearly 5 times that of white people, right? In terms of other statistics, we know that 1 out of 3 African-American males are more likely to be sentenced for a lifetime prison sentence of at least 10 years. African-American males make up 40.2 of the U.S. Prison population. Keep that in mind, my friends. Another interesting statistic is this, that Black women are more likely to be incarcerated and are more likely to be killed by law enforcement. So think about that. When we talk about Black women, they're more likely to be incarcerated, twice as likely as white women, and they're more likely to be killed by law enforcement, at least 1.3 times more likely than others. And here's what I like to say: if our women are not okay, then we are not okay. A few more statistics before we move forward. The United States spends over $87 billion on jails and prisons. It's estimated that $65,000 is spent on an inmate with mental health conditions versus an inmate that does not have a mental health condition at $35,000. So think about that. $65,000 versus $35,000 is spent on inmates in terms of mental health conditions. And my friends, the 3 largest psychiatric facilities in America are prisons in LA County, in Chicago, and in New York City, Rikers Island. Wow, wow. Staggering and sobering statistics. George, did you want to speak to that, my friend?
Sure. Those are staggering statistics. And in relation to Black women, they are the fastest growing prison population in the country. I would also suggest the number or some of the worst statistics out there around the Bureau of Justice statistics that came out not that long ago that did a longitudinal study on recidivism, meaning the rate at which people return to prison. And that rate, they found that the study was, instead of looking at markers at 1 year, 3 year, and 5 years, which are the normal markers when you're thinking about the study or research around recidivism, i.e. the rate at which people return to prison. And obviously, when you're dealing with statistics, it depends on what you count actually as recidivism. Is it a parole violation? Is it a new arrest? Or is it only convictions?
Wow.
Regardless of how we want to define it, statistics show that after 9 years, pushing it from 5 to 9, that 83% of people released from prison. return.
Wow. Wow.
That's a staggering statistic. And I would suggest that we've taken a solely individual approach to that. For example, I've gone to, as you mentioned, now this topic is from jail to Yale. I'm also at Georgetown. If 83% of the students were failing out of Georgetown, or if 83% of the students were failing out of Yale, I guarantee the only questions that would be raised would not only be what's going on with those students, it would be there must be some systemic issue within the system itself that is affecting students in a particular type of way. It seems that when it comes to the criminal legal system and the prison system, those types of systemic questions are not answered. And hopefully we can get into some of that later on too.
Wow. Wow. Good stuff. And someone listening, they might say, those are numbers, those are statistics. And here's what I suggest, and I'll use your word suggest, and here's my premise surrounding statistics, that statistics are not political, but they really represent people. So often people will politicize statistics, but these are numbers that are reflective of people, their journeys, their experiences. And I want people to lean into that, right? The numbers are what they are, right? They're not political. They're not meant to, to speak to any of that. They're really meant so that we would become more empathetic and more therapeutic, so to speak, towards those with this journey. So let's jump right in from jail to Yale. Tell us your story. In fact, your story is what has initiated this title of From Jail to Yale. So let's talk about your story.
Sure. Even previous to that, anytime I tell my story, especially over the last, I would say 6 or 7 years, I just like to have a moment of silence for everybody impacted by the criminal legal system, whether it's those who are on the inside or those who are out. And I realize that my story at times can come at the expense of people's real pain. And as you mentioned, statistics are just, in my mind, numerical representations of reality. And so I just want to have a moment of silence in respect of that reality. Thank you. So I grew up in upstate New York. I was born to Greek parents, and as you can probably see, I don't really look Greek. And so I think early on, after my parents told me that I was adopted, I started to see the world through the lens of difference. And whether that difference was exacerbated in terms of the way I felt or the way people acted towards me or my actual perceptions of that difference, it began to shape my young mind in a particular type of way. My parents, they were good people, but sometimes in relationships, people may be good individuals, but not really great together. And so they kind of struggled in their marriage. I had one adopted brother. We can talk about that later. Who struggled with serious mental health challenges, so much so that he was in and out of what is called mental institutions. In Albany Medical Center, they have these wards, Ward C3, and I think it's E2 and E3, and those are just different levels in the psychiatric ward in that hospital. Eventually, he decided to take his life, and I found him in the backyard of our home. And I can't get that image out of my mind. I believe that I've come up with better ways of coping with it, but that image is seared in my mind. And so while these are not excuses, these are more so just things that happened in my life that I had to make decisions in real time about. And unfortunately, I made some very bad decisions. I made some decisions to use drugs fairly early on. Started drinking at 16, was arrested for the first time at 18, went to the county jail for 5 months and 10 days. In 1994, when I was 20 years old, my son was born at that time, 3 months into my sentence in March of 1994. And eventually I got out, and prison was this, the county jails are, I don't want to say interesting is not the word, but there's not a lot of programming. Having been to state prison now and realizing some of the programs that are there and the approach to programming is much different inside of prisons than it is in the local jail, mainly probably because people aren't there long. You're not sentenced yet. You could be there for a few hours, up into a few years, depending on the system that you're in, and whether you've actually been convicted or whether you're awaiting release or just going through a number of different scenarios within the criminal legal system. And so after being quote unquote released, I went back to the life that I was living. And after my brother had taken his life in 1995, I got heavy into harder drugs. And eventually that came to a head to where I was sitting in Montreal, Canada, in an apartment, and Canadian Immigration and Montreal PD, along with the FBI in tow, came to arrest me because in my best thinking, I decided I could walk into 5 different banks and make a withdrawal without having an account. And I think while one of the things that weighs on my mind, especially today, and in light of the conversation we're having, and related to mental health, is while no one may have been physically hurt, I don't know about the psychological trauma that I caused. Having a wife that deals with PTSD and other forms of trauma myself as well, I know that just the mere passing of time doesn't address these issues. And so I wonder sometimes, are those effects still lingering over 23 years later, and how they affected all the different social roles as mother, as father, as sister, as brother, because I see how it's affected my own family. And so while in prison in 2000, it was 6 years after what we now know as the infamous 1994 crime bill that restricted people in prison from having access to Pell Grants. And so I entered a prison system where before 1994, there had been hundreds of programs, college programs, and over 1,000 facilities. And then after this restriction that was in the 1994 crime bill, it went down from 1994 to 1998 down to 8 programs in the whole country. Wow. There were 0 undergraduate programs I could take advantage of when I was in prison. And so eventually I was shipped around the state. Every chaplain took a liking to me. That's another part of the story. I was baptized in 2001. I can't believe it's been almost 22 years since that happened. And then I found myself in Eastern Correctional Facility. I started off in the infamous Sing Sing prison. Sing Sing, I believe, was built in 1825. It had a fire in the 1850s. And what you see today is the buildings from that era. I remember going in, reaching out both of my arms, and I'm not that tall. I'm about 5'7", 5'8", and I could touch both sides of the cell, and it was me, 2 football lockers, a toilet, and somebody else. I went back recently in 2020 with a program and actually met with the current superintendent, who was not the superintendent when I was there in the early 2000s. But after we had this conversation with him, I was there with the Frederick Douglass Project. They gave us the tour of the jail, and I felt like I could have given the tour. And we actually went to my old cell block, and I walked into it. And now, mind you, I was released in 2011, so this is at least 9 years after I was released. A couple things. Number one, psychologically, I didn't realize how small the unit was. And I saw somebody hunched over against his cell, like against his cell bars. And remember, I mentioned that it was me and somebody else in there. There was somebody, it was him by himself, and he looked cramped. It looked like cages upon cages upon cages. And I wonder psychologically why it seems so big. Why did that space? I'm not sure how you reform that. I'm not sure how we can take human beings, place them in cages like animals, and expect people to come out whole. Most recently, I was in a meeting with folks from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and the new director, Colette Peters, said something astonishing that I'd never heard from someone in corrections before. She said, the goal of corrections should not be to make good inmates, but good neighbors. Wow. And so from 2000, and then in 2002, a year after being in Sing Sing, I found myself in Eastern Correctional Facility. And this where, in my current role at the Bureau Institute of Justice, we believe that luck should not be the reason why some people have access to college and other people don't. I found out Bard College had just started offering college courses. They hadn't had a graduation yet. They didn't even know at the time if there was going to be a bachelor degree program, but they were starting an associate's program. And 4 years into my sentence, there were 72,000 people in prison each year. And for reasons outside of bar's control, they could only take 15. And so I think of the other 4,000 to 5,000 people that didn't get in. So for every one person that got in, almost 5,000 didn't. And so part of my ministry and my life is haunted by the fact, or invigorated by the fact, that I left people in prison way smarter than me, greater drive and determination. I just wonder who they could be, or whom we as a society could be if we unlock the potential of the 2.1 million people languishing in human warehouses of despair that we call prisons. I thrived in Bard. Number one, it's like this cage-like cell I was in was no longer just a cage. It was also like a study hall for intellectual curiosity, where I'm poring over texts and learning languages, and reading philosophy and literature and sociology and anthropology and the breadth of a liberal arts education. The yard was no longer like The Walking Dead, where arguments ended in punches, but in periods where people were debating, having philosophical debates around different theories and the history of ideas. So much so that a later generation, much smarter than me, in 2016 or late 2015, actually a debate team was started in that very jail that beat Harvard. Wow. Harvard's #1 debate team, and Cambridge's, I might add. They came from across the pond, and also had an intellectual debate with those in prison, where those in prison came out on top at the end of the endeavor. And so it radically changed the world. It changed the way I saw myself and others. There was a community, an intellectual community that was developed. And we didn't just think about this for ourselves, but we pulled other people out, so much so that eventually Barr started offering a math degree. And the gentleman who was in the math, getting his math degree for the first time, would have classes for other students. And you had people in pre-GED doing calculus. Some knew math better than their professors. Eventually, I earned an associate's degree and a bachelor's degree. And almost 10 years to the day, I was back in Sing Sing, because Sing Sing did have, the prison system did have one master's program. They did not have an undergraduate program, but they had one master's program. At the time, it was the only professional master's degree granting program in the country, offered by New York Theological Seminary, which was training people to become ministers. And I was accepted in 2010. And I had a little bit less than 2 years left in my sentence. In the second semester of that master's program, a professor used a textbook co-authored by 2 Yale University School of Divinity graduates who were not from New York. One was from outside of Boston, one was from outside of Chicago. And they were doing a book tour near Sing Sing, and our professor, because they were in the same denomination, the UCC, invited them in. And at the end of the conversation said, what's the possibility of somebody like me going to a place like Yale when I get out of here? I did not know. Well, they didn't know I was getting out in a few months. I didn't know that no one who was formerly incarcerated had ever gone to Yale Divinity School, and no one who was formerly incarcerated and began his or her educational journey in prison went to Yale overall. And so when I was released in 2011, it was right after the crash, so there wasn't funding for a lot of programs and reentry programs. And so I found it fairly difficult, because the physical transition from prison to society can take a minute, but the psychological transition can take a lot longer, even a lifetime. And under 2 years of being out, I was the first formerly incarcerated person to go to Yale Divinity School. I ended up earning a Master of Divinity degree, and then stayed on for a Master of Sacred Theology degree in theology. I was also giving one of my classes preaching awards in 2016. In 2015, my wife, my son's mother, that son who was born in when I was in jail, looked me up online and couldn't believe that the person she knew from the 1990s was at Yale. So she called to see if it was true. And we had not talked at the time in 2015 since 1997. So this is 18 years later. My son was 21 at the time, and he didn't even remember me. We got back together. I married her in June of 2016, and he was my best man at 22 years old. Wow. We're actually going on vacation next week. After I graduated from Yale, I moved on to come down to the DC area, worked at Georgetown as a program manager, and it's first of its kind program called Pivot, where Georgetown offers a certificate in business fundamentals and entrepreneurship to formerly incarcerated DC residents. Then I moved on to Vera, because the two things were a reality inside of my life. Number one is I had a number of mentors who had acquired some level of education through Pell Grants in the late 80s and early 1990s. And number two, they all had some form of a life sentence. And so I was asked to go to Capitol Hill to talk about the reason why we need to restore Pell Grant eligibility for all people in prison, and basically, and all people in society, whether if you have a felony. And so I was hired by Vera Institute of Justice to kind of coach me a little bit from Georgetown, but everybody at Georgetown said this is something you have to do. And so I was hired to lead the federal policy strategy. That was a national campaign to restore Pell Grants. And in 2020, we got Pell Grant restoration for all currently incarcerated folks and anybody with a felony on outside. So now anyone can access a federal Pell Grant if you qualify. So it's not a zero-sum game. We're giving a Pell Grant to folks in prison is somehow taking away from others. Anyone that qualifies under federal guidelines can receive a Pell Grant. And then I was accepted as the first formerly incarcerated PhD student and Healy Fellow. We can talk about that maybe later. I received this scholarship. Georgetown calls it prestigious, so we'll find out. And so I want to use my education where I study comparative liberation theologies and think about theologically about mass incarceration, criminal legal system reform, but ultimately how we can help people live their best lives and allow all of society to function and to flourish in ways that are assets and not liabilities.
Wow, amazing. What an amazing story. And let me say this, it's been a great honor to be on this journey with you, to have watched just an amazing story of hope, recovery, resilience, restitution, forgiveness, reparative justice, and the list goes on and on. But my friend, it's just been an honor to watch your journey, and a journey that's been highlighted by faith, right? We've heard that a lot, your faith in Christ, in God. And I just want to let you know that you are an amazing inspiration to those who are watching. When they've heard your story, it would have given them hope to live out their own stories and their own journeys and destinies.
We've known each other going on almost 20 years now. I think we met back in 2005, right after my first semester at inside of prison at Eastern Correctional Facility. And I still remember the sermon that you preached for our men's Bible study discipleship graduation. So I'm thankful for you. And we've known each other quite a long time and seen each other's journey.
Wow, amazing, amazing. You're an amazing testimony of God's grace, a trophy of God's grace. Dare to say a trophy of reparative justice, a trophy of the criminal reform system. As we bring this to a close, you mentioned in the beginning your lived experience with mental health. You mentioned a lived experience surrounding, of course, trauma, suicide. What would you say to someone about managing our mental health? What would you say to us, those who are listening? Again, your journey has involved, several of those experiences, but you're coping, you're managing, you're navigating. And here's what you're doing. You're also bringing hope and healing to others. And that's as a result of, you managing your mental health. Can you speak to that as we bring this to a close?
Well, I can say first and foremost that I haven't always done a good job of caring for my mental health or making the best decisions in dealing with trauma. And so here's some things that I've learned when I'm in situations where I'm trying to comfort or provide care to someone else, or to walk alongside someone else who's dealing with trauma inside of his or her life. Number one is finding long-term supports. One of the things that happened when my brother passed, because of, for whatever reason, we were only given we were only allowed 3 visits or 3 therapy visits. That is no time to really process not just the trauma of the event, but also these trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
There's a context. And for my family's context, there were years that led up to a decision like that. Decisions like that where someone decides to take his or her life, as I found out afterwards that there was a letter beforehand. And obviously hindsight is 2020. So when I look back, I can see some of the signs, the isolation, the not finding joy in things that he used to do, the isolation from friends and from family, sitting in the basement for long periods of time and not wanting to come out or engage society. Obviously, looking back, you can see all of that, but in real time, the difficulty was that there were other challenges, so there were other things going on surrounding within the family dynamics, that our family wasn't in a healthy space, and especially in the 70s and 80s in an insular Greek community, you don't talk about your problems. You have to put on this. You have your struggles and your trauma in the home, and then as soon as you come out, you're supposed to put on this face like everything's okay. And I think we've gotten a little better at allowing people and families to voice the fact that they're not okay. And we have different supports and services today, but also where church communities can come in, where not every church can do everything. But if we have a resource base, meaning that I know that my church can't do everything. My pastor is not a therapist, but my church community has resources that we can point people to. So we are conduits, finding out making sure that people know the pathways to resources when trauma is going on. I would say something else that I would say to families is, I was angry at my brother for years. I was very angry because I was adopted. I mean, I have since found my biological family, but I now had to live with the fact that, number one, I had this image in my mind that I couldn't get away from. Number two, I would never have a brother. I'd have to tell my son one day, if he ever asked, what happened to Uncle Nicky? And so you can relive that trauma at different times in your life. And so I would suggest, what I've tried to do is not so much reframe it, but think of, from his standpoint, he must have been hurting deeply. And I'm not trying to place blame on anyone, but I'm wondering, what were the interventions that could have happened earlier on? Were there different, and obviously no one can force anybody to do anything, but were there interventions earlier on that maybe could have helped and avoided a situation where someone feels that their only option is to take his or her life? Realizing the family dynamics, the challenges that it happens to family, especially if families where there's already struggle. For example, everybody blamed each other. Actually, the chapter of my first book is going to start with a phrase from my mother. Now I understand things differently, where she grabbed my hands and she pushed them away and she said, "No, I don't have a good son left." Now, obviously, that's out of deep pain. And I know that she loved me because up until when she passed just months ago, everyone tells me how I'm so proud of my son and look at what he's accomplished. And so, but in that moment, people make decisions and say things, and pain and grief gets, the internal pain and grief comes out maybe sometimes in unhealthy external ways. And so realizing that people in these moments may have thoughts, may say things, may do things that later they might regret, or they wouldn't say, or be in the midst of deep pain. And so for those that are surrounding and supporting, as you know from offering counseling, having kind of like this emotional distance, really, that it's not personal, while also helping people get through it. Also, I think realizing that people just don't get over things. Right. And we have to help people find ways, but you can get past what you can't get over. Right. You can move past what you can't get over. So those are some of the things that I would suggest to families: reach out early on, find resources and support, and be willing to go through the process, and realizing that healing is not on any schedule, and that it's okay to grieve. It's okay to find resources. It's okay to say it's not okay, but know that healing can happen.
Wow. George, thank you so much for your amazing story. Again, we've talked about, your story. Of course, we're titling this From Jail to Yale. And I just want to lean in to those who are watching that your story might not be from jail to Yale, but whatever your story might be, take a cue from this amazing story of hope, resilience, recovery, strength. Um, that as you put in the work, which is what George has done, he's put in the work at each stage of his journey. And as a result, we're seeing the chapters of his book unfold right before our eyes. I like what you've talked about. And I'll say it this way: we can change what we won't talk about, what we won't confront, what we won't deal with. And my friend, that's what you've done. You've talked about it. You've confronted it. You are dealing with it. The other thing I'll say to people is feel what you feel. Try to put a name to what you've been feeling, because when you name it, you can tame it, and of course, deal with it. George, how can people reach out to you? How can people connect with you?
Sure. So the best way is that email. And so my email is George, George, .chochos, CHOCHOS @aya.yale.edu. You can find me on social media, on Facebook under my name. And so I hope that people do reach out. If you're struggling, if you're going through challenges, if you have a loved one. If I could just say one thing: many times I'm in churches where people will walk up to me after I share parts of my story, and they'll whisper in my ear, my husband, my son, my daughter is in jail. They're in the house of hope and healing and feel that they can't express some of their deepest pains. And so I would suggest that if folks are going through that and that's you, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to guide you to resources and to help walk with you during some of these difficult times.
George, thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for staying. Thank you for putting in the work. We also want to remind those who are listening just to add to what George has stated about reaching out and getting the help that you need, having access to care and resources. We want to remind you that if you or your loved one might find yourself in crisis, please contact 988. That's the 24-hour, 7-day National Crisis and Suicide Lifeline. So again, if you or your loved one might find yourself in crisis, please reach out, as George has said. We're going to put George's contact information on the screen. 988 will also come up on the screen. We also want to remind you, for more resources about mental health, please visit the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org. That will also come up on the screen. And then, as always, we invite you to visit our website at C3In This Together for more resources surrounding mental health, suicide, disability awareness. And of course, my friends, if you've been impacted by this video, please hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to our YouTube channel, C3In This Together. Please share this video, comment on this video. Let us know how you've been impacted, so that together we could do what George has done. He's bringing hope and healing to others. He's not limiting his story to histrionics, but instead he's using his platform to bring hope and healing. My friends, thank you for joining us for 30 minutes in our own voice, and we hope to see you next time. George, thank you again, my friend. I am so proud of you, so proud of the work, so blessed to see your journey. Continue to share your story, because I know your story is bringing hope and bringing meaning, and also giving voice to others to share their own stories. My friend, we'll see you next time for 30 minutes in our own voice. George, we'll see you, my friend.
Thank you. Take care.